The state, as the supreme political authority within a defined territory, has never been a static entity. Its functions, responsibilities, and relationship with society and the economy have continuously evolved in response to historical forces, ideological shifts, and global developments. This unit, Changing Role of the State, Issues and Challenges, is dedicated to exploring this dynamic transformation in the contemporary era. Traditionally seen as the primary provider of security, justice, and essential public goods, and in many places, the central architect of the economy through the welfare state model, the state is now facing profound pressures to redefine its role. This shift is not merely an administrative adjustment, but a fundamental recalibration driven by powerful forces, most notably the rise of neoliberal ideology and the multifaceted process of globalization. These forces advocate for a withdrawal of the state from direct economic management in favor of market mechanisms, urging it to become a facilitator and regulator rather than a direct provider. This unit will guide you through this complex terrain. We will begin by conceptualizing the changing nature of the state, 3.2, moving beyond traditional definitions to understand its modern incarnation. We will then trace the historical trajectory of this change, 3.3, understanding the context that led to the current paradigm. A significant portion of our analysis will be dedicated to critically interrogating the neoliberal state within the context of globalization, 3.4. This involves examining how global economic integration dictates national policies, often limiting state sovereignty and creating new social and economic challenges that the retreating state is ill-equipped to handle. By the end of this unit, you will have a deeper understanding of the critical issues and formidable challenges facing the modern state as it navigates the turbulent waters of the 21st century, balancing the demands of global markets with its fundamental obligations to its citizens. Unit 3, CHANGNG Role of the State, Issues and CHALLNGS Structure 3, Zero Learning Outcome 3.1 Introduction 3, 2 Changing Nature of the State 3.3, The Trajectory of Change 3, 4 Interrogating the Neoliberal State in the Era of Globalization 3, 5 Conclusion 3, 6 Key Concepts 3.7 References and further reading 3.8 Activity 3, 0 Learning Outcome. After reading this unit, you will be able to appreciate the changing nature of the state, trace the trajectory of the evolution of the state, discuss the role of the neoliberal state in the backdrop of globalization, and understand the shape of the new state in the making. 3. 1 Introduction. The study of the state has traditionally been a problem area because such studies have seldom been free from pro-establishment or pro-authority bias. From an epistemological angle, it means the same as saying that state has seldom been treated as what it quintessentially is, a historically evolving phenomenon taking shape in response to changing times and conditions of the society. Not that history of state formation has been totally overlooked. From the historical systems analysis of Rostow to the historical structural analysis of André Gunder Frank, the state has been treated from a historical perspective only cosmetically. C. Wright Mills had warned that history can neither be introduced as an introductory padding nor as an ad hoc procedure, which unfortunately is common among most scholars of the state. This historical trend of scholarship on the state has degenerated to a pathetic level lately, and this trend is easily evidenced by endless descriptions of the state. Just to take a sample of the third world state only, as distinguished from the state in the developed world of the West, the 1960s and 1970s witnessed an outpouring of literature on a modernizing, or one, developmental state of the functional systems, theorists as contrasted against their radical counterparts invoking strong, overdeveloped, and relatively autonomous, post-colonial states. Whereas the critical decade of the 80s produced rather an ambiguous set of concepts such as the rentier state, the peripheral state, or the bureaucratic authoritarian state, the globally sensitive 90s allowed its negative imagery to take a good float on the state, which came to be described as vassal state, predator state, vampire state, receiver state, prostrate state, and even fictitious state, show of state, or collapsed state, Manor, 1991. What is the way out of these scholastic straw thrashings, Gramsci's famous expression for the non-revolutionary intellectuals. As long as the scholarship on state fails to shake off its ideological hang-ups, it will always be maintained that state sovereignty is on the decline in these days of global capitalism, even though the same thought seems to exclude the mighty American state. Instances of scholars extolling American exceptionalism, allowing this mighty power in a unipolar world to freely enunciate and ruthlessly implement its doctrine of national interest on the territory of other less endowed, but equally sovereign states are not rare. Against this backdrop, the present unit will explore some of the issues connected with the changing trajectory of the state, including its correct status in the contemporary globalization context. 3. Changing nature of the state. An objective and dispassionate viewing of the state as a historical phenomenon would entail in its analysis their interconnections as an integrated totality. This is a dialectical view encompassing both intra- and inter-levels of interconnections, which actually provide the moving motor to history. Does this unfolding of history, evolution of state, in our context, mean that external causes have little role in its formation? Not at all. It holds that external causes are the condition of change and the internal conditions are the basis of change, and that external causes become operative through internal causes. In a suitable temperature, as Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, once put it, an egg changes into a chicken, but no temperature can change a stone into a chicken, because each has a different basis. Roots of change are to be traced to these twin ground realities, viz. Basis, internal, and conditions, external. A continuous process of embedding of such changes is another name for history which alone, therefore, can convey a holistic view of the phenomenon, i.e. the state in our case in question. There is another layer of thick icing over understanding of the state, further into its changing role. This pertains to its relationship with society. It should be clearly understood that state is a creation, a political contrivance of the society, and it is not an unavoidable anthropological need. State is not an organ of the society. Former's appearance and growth are inorganic to the human needs and survival. This way of viewing helps unlock a vast vista, which surrounds the state in its nature and functions ever since princes and lords struggled during 14th and 19th centuries, and effected a model of national unity, as scripted in the Westphalian Treaty of 1648, and the Westphalian Order had the nation-state as its kingpin. It flourished till the World War II, which marked the end of this global era. David Held has insightfully summarized the Westphalian model in terms of its following features. 2. The world consists of, and is divided by, sovereign states which recognize no superior authority. The processes of lawmaking, the settlement of disputes, and law enforcement are largely in the hands of individual states, subject to the logic of the competitive struggle for power. Differences among the states are often settled by force. The principle of effective power holds sway. Virtually no legal fetters exist to curb the resort to force. International legal standards afford minimal protection. Responsibility for cross-border wrongful acts are a private matter concerning only those affected. No collective interest in compliance with international law is recognized. All states are regarded as equal before the law. Legal rules do not take account of asymmetries of power. International law is oriented to the establishment of minimal rules of coexistence, the creation of enduring relationships among the states, and people is an aim only to the extent that it allows military objectives to be met. The minimization of impediments on the states, freedom, is the collective priority, C.F. Pearson, 1996. There are two major operating principles of the Westphalian system: the liberal state, which grudgingly conceded space to individuals' welfare, and the balance of power, which held the states together through fear of punishment for disturbing the status quo. The operation of the liberal state complemented the balance of power. The former promoted justice at home in terms of granting civil and political rights, but not social and economic rights, and promoting a self-regulating market at home and abroad. The latter saw to it that the competition of the economic systems does not disturb the prevailing asymmetries, interstate, and considerations of justice do not extend to non-European states. However, powerfully minded, this train got derailed and the Second World War broke out. Toynbee's famous characterization of an ideological revolution, nationalism, which reinforced the Westphalian order, has actually substituted religion and made the state an object of worship, started showing the results. They were soon realized in, which is famously known as post-war social contract, another name for the welfare state which takes its birth in these circumstances. This welfare capitalism, Lord Keynes was its main architect, has on its agenda for the labor to accept capital's right to ownership and overall economic direction in exchange for social benefits, an expanding welfare state, and a guaranteed level of employment security. Graph, 1995. This historic social pact actually marked the onset of the Counter-Westphalian order, though. It should in all fairness be mentioned at the same time. This contract was not strictly applied to the masses of the Third World for its welfarist benefits. And that was the breeding ground of a primary contradiction, as Klaus Off has insightfully highlighted. For the capital which found itself implicated, because of those concessions it gave to people and institutions in the previous era. According to Off, the welfare 3-oriented concessions may have brought greater social peace and increased mass purchasing power, but in the long run, it turned out to be also a limitation on capital. Sphere of action, flexibility, and profitability, and hence a threat to its power. Capital's logical response, according to him, was to unilaterally abrogate this welfare contract and resuscitate the market forces, which were under the state's regulation under this historic contract, mainly by means of wresting functions and powers from the state and privatizing or abolishing them. Ibid. This is the advent of globalization in recent times, which has submerged most of the Third World countries, though they had also not been the direct beneficiaries of the welfare state dispensations earlier. Trade, rather than domestic mass purchasing power, has become the driving force of the new global economy. This is despite the fact that not more than 1/4 of global trade comes under the GATT, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, i.e. regulated free trade. Internationalized division of labor has become the unfortunate norm, as internationalized production has eclipsed Fordist mass production. Part-time, low-wage employment, the McDonaldization of the workforce, becomes the norm for most, while high-quality, high-technology governed production around information and communication technology, ICT, are reserved for select few. The implication for state is nothing but to adapt to these new strategies. Since there are no longer any national economies or national industries or national companies, observes Robert Reich, 1991, all that remains behind are people who share a political system. Each nation's primary political task is to cope with the centrifugal forces of the global economy. Prof. Adrain Leftwich, 1994, makes the point clearer. According to him, the distinguishing characteristic of development states, i.e., states with consistent average economic growth of 4% or more during the past 3 decades, e.g. India, has been that their institutional structures, especially their economic bureaucracies, have been developmentally driven, while their developmental purposes have been politically driven. In short, fundamentally political factors have shaped the thrust and pace of their development through the changing structures of the state. Has this drive towards globalization, ever on increase in scope and intensity, generated adversarial conditions, in which state, especially in the Third World, is under pressure to offer the wrong end of the stick to its people? 2 concurrent flows are visible in these days of counter-Westphalian order in the making. While the growth of a global consciousness leading to occasional spurts of initiative to form a global civil society is very much in evidence, the twin operating principles of free trade, and Roman II, revolutionary uses of ICT, which geared up globalization on a World Trade Organization, WTO, vehicle, are no more offering assurances to capital multinational corporations, MNCs, of 100% return. On free trade front, the matter boiled up on the eve of 2004 U.S. presidential elections. None other than Prof. Samuelson challenging the claims of free trade orthodoxy, led by Profs. Bhagawati and N. Gregory Mankiw, that the amount of winnings from free trade would more than compensate for the job loss caused due to outsourcing, and telling the public that the Luddites may after all be having a point in protesting against an annual outflow of a large number of jobs. It is important to bear in mind that Prof. Bhagawati, whose name is now identical with free trade, had only recently praised Prof. Samuelson as the greatest economist of the last century. 4. On the ICT front, the revolutionary potential has done as harm to the capital as it did good to the common person on the streets. We have, for instance, on the authority of Prof. Mahmoud Mamdani, to know that Mr. al-Zawahiri, the ideologue of al-Qaeda, and second to Osama bin Laden, insisted on leadership to be technologically savvy, and it has to recognize that the old methods must give way to the new. He says the technology available now, particularly the internet, will build up cadres and you don't have to seek them. Mamdani, 2004. Whether it is mass politics protest against the Chilean dictator Pinochet or President Bush against American invasion of Iraq, the internet has come in handy to the people to rally together with the help of this communication technology, which also undid the welfare state to a substantial extent. Social development-oriented uses of ICT are far too many in the fields of public health, farmers' market, grievances redressal, etc. The development discourse, which centered around the Washington Consensus, originally contained a list of 10 reforms aimed at attracting private capital as the Latin American states became sluggish in their dispensations towards their people following the debt crisis of the 80s. But very soon this focus shifted to the second generation of reforms centering around governance, emphasizing on the caring aspects of the state's day-to-day functioning and demanding more accountability, transparency, and openness. An important point to note further in this connection is that the Washington Consensus was not strictly followed by many states, though it has been the philosopher driver of globalization. China did not follow the consensus to the text. The Chinese relied heavily on public enterprise and state intervention. India also didn't fall in line, strictly speaking. The 4 BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, may have benefited but definitely not their poor whose numbers are also swelling. Further, most other third world countries were pauperized by this global integration of national economy on an iniquitous footing. Good old end of history, theorizer. In 1989, Prof. Fukuyama has, of course, come full circle in his revised narrative published in the summer of 2004. As Prof. Fukuyama says now, the September 11 is the date when the Reagan-Thatcher era ended, because that day underscored a key feature of the post-Cold War world. While the great problems of world order in the 20th century were caused by two powerful nation-states, such as Germany, Japan, and the former Soviet Union, many of the problems of our current age, from poverty to refugees to human rights to HIV/AIDS to terrorism, are caused by states in the developing world that are too weak. Many problems have come from lack of sufficient state oversight, laments Fukuyama, having extolled the triumph of liberalism and privatization only a decade ago. The easy gains from privatization and deregulation have long since been achieved. Bring back the state, pleads Prof. Fukuyama, now Indian Express, July 10, 2004. Interestingly, both the quoted passages are reactive in nature, one for the states in the Third World and the other for the American state. Obviously, you cannot have one standard for the East and another for the West. Truth of the matter actually is that the state's efforts need to be supplemented now, and rollback is not the answer. Again, state needs to change its old-time thinking mindset and learn to evolve and depend on alternative sources and frames of action and thinking. Otherwise, estimates by Mann, 1990, and others have clearly shown that the state expenditure, whether on war and administration as in 18th and 20th centuries or on social development during 19th century, on societal activities has been static at 30–40% level or on rise, as some others have maintained. It has been mostly a matter of attitude of governance rather than a categorical change from public to private. In his most recent book, Plan B, Lester Brown, 2005, has convincingly argued that planet Earth is indeed in peril as evidenced by burgeoning undernourished population, the HIV/AIDS menace, water crisis, falling land productivity and adverse climate change induced by a fossil-driven industrial economy basically of the developed West. There has been enough prognosis now. The task is to change the mindset of the people in power and look for alternative actors and sources to complement the failing state efforts. In this direction, one notices diverse NGO-launched initiatives to soften the adverse impact of globalization, which has since emphasized the twin principles of devolution of powers and participative development at the grassroots level. Food self-reliance, to take only one example, is one such approach which, on the global scale, had many such NGO takers. Jamaica's Grow Our Own Food campaign, Bangladesh's Grameen Bank experiment, and similar local experiments in Zimbabwe and a number of African and Latin American countries. Many such initiatives elsewhere have joined the state in supplementing its efforts at food security and nutrition. Another glaring example, not to be missed, is the adversarial effects of global warming, which had forced a change in the attitude of the government as well as the elites, shifting now towards alternative sources of energy. Germany already has 12,000 MW of wind-based electricity generating capacity, and Denmark, with 2,900 MW, is meeting 18% of its electricity needs through this renewable source. India has an impressive fifth position in the world with 1,700 MW non-conventional energy, the Hindu, 2005. Non-governmental initiatives have made an important presence in the global society today, and they have introduced a new dimension, viz. a drive towards common or universal standards and consciousness, and a new global constituency for change. Communication technologies only facilitate this social phenomenon. Patel, 1995. Another important distinguishing feature of the emerging global society is that some of the institutions for the management and governance of this global society are already in place. The reinvigorated UN agencies have chalked out a proactive stance for themselves. Witness World Conference's 1990s on environment, human rights, gender justice, population growth, urban development, etc., which got the governments moving to commit themselves to the various social development goals. As Amartya Sen told recently to the Commission on the Status of Women, March 2005, at its special session in New York, the United Nations is often separated out these days for particular chastisement for being ineffective, or worse. The UN and the intellectual and political movements associated with it have contributed greatly to making our world a bit less nasty and more livable. C.F. Jane, 2005. Human development and human security, two new themes in human aspirations, have occupied center of stage in these international bodies. These innovative articulations entailing a rearrangement of resource allocation profiles for new commitments need to be met. However, all these may not mean much despite the massive support these new commitments command among the masses of the world. A perceptive management thinker, I.G. Patel, Op. Cit., has identified 5 difficult but unavoidable problems, which will become more urgent in the years to come as the hostile globalizing forces come closing in around humanity. The legitimacy of individual and group rights, and the role of the global society vis-à-vis these rights, equity in the governance of international institutions, equity in international economic relations, equity and global environmental protection, matching responsibilities with resources at the global level. The Counter-Westphalian Order has to solve the problems outlined above so that a society which is politically plural, economically egalitarian, ecologically sensitive, and societally diverse and accommodative finally results along with a responsive state whose powers are best exercised through sharing and accountability. Summarily speaking, the international community's dedication for fulfillment of the Millennium Development Goals pertaining to humanity's well-being has been inspired by the motto of the Counter-Westphalian Order. Free development of each is a condition of the free development of all. Having outlined the conditions of change, general politico-economic environs which have overtaken the state, let us now turn to the basis of changes which the state has undergone till date. We will conclude the mapping of this trajectory of change in the role of state with a profile sketch of the state in the current globalization context. 3. The trajectory of change. We have already read about the evolution of the concept of the state in the views of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Bentham, Mills, and others in our introductory unit of this course. More analyses by liberal and Marxist thinkers on state would be made in the next unit, i.e. Unit 4 later. Over here, we would trace the ideological trajectory of the state, the evolutionary path of the state's postures. The story of modern state formation owes a lot to two seminal themes which continue to exert influence on state formation till date. They are the Greek city-state, or polis, and the Roman Republic. Polis, in its turn, gave us seeds of two very powerful ideas associated with the modern state. Democracy from demos, or the rule of the people or the citizenry, and Roman II, the political politics from polis. The concept of direct democracy owes its lineage to this locality-based concept of citizenship, which was, however, challenged by Rome, which too arose as a powerful city-state. The Roman Republic never allowed itself to be democratized. It was run by a senate comprising the aristocrats and the consuls, who were later on added, elected by the assemblies of the whole people. Important to note is that the Roman citizenship was defined by law, rather than by strict territoriality. This notion that the state power is founded in law influenced subsequent developments associated with rule of law in democratic governments. Similarly, a systematized code of Roman law is another major contribution to modern state formation. Roman law actually helped to form the distinction between state and seven. Society, or between the public republic, i.e. the state, and the private, i.e. with reference to civil society. Cicero's formulation that we obey laws in order to be free has a distinct modernist ring. When the Romans advanced northwards, they encountered the Germanic tribes who were essentially clan societies. They also employed a different conception of law. In contrast with the formality of Roman law, the Germanic law was said to belong to people comprising a summary of their common customs. It was from these roots that the English later traced the origin of their parliament and the English system of common law. To recapitulate major issues and challenges of modern state: democracy, political participation, rule of law, customary sources of governance, role of parliament, etc., have their roots in the pages of ancient history of modern state. The evolution of the feudal states roughly in the 800 AD. An attempt was made to recreate the imperial system of Rome under the patronage of the Catholic Church. This politically unified Christian empire consisted of a variety of counts, dukes and princes owing allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor who, however, was incessantly troubled by the underlying tension-ridden system of social and economic relations. Add to this, there was the Germanic vassal system, where leading warriors pledged their loyalty in return for protection received. The vast population at the base, G. Poggi, 1990, observes in his classical work The State, its nature, development, and prospects were the objects of rule, but never the subjects of a political relationship. The lord-serf relationship was the cell form of a feudal economy. The lord-vassal relationship was the cell form of political rule. Except in northern France and England, where monarchy was more unified and stronger, rest of the Europe witnessed a saga of lords vying with each other operating from their small, personal pockets. Power became both more personal and more local in focus. As Anderson observes, in each area there were conflicting systems of loyalty, a social world of overlapping claims and powers. Some lords became too powerful for the feudal monarch to resist. More often the latter composed them into his consultative bodies, which in fact were early forms of parliament that played an important role from the 13th century onwards. The feudal state thus was constantly torn by internal dissensions, while of course, the monarchy tried to distinguish itself, and the towns and cities remained outside the classical feudal system because of their independent charters. Medieval towns were islands in the sea of feudalism, and the leading citizens won the right to administer themselves as a corporate body under a charter which they gave to themselves. The burghers in great towns and cities of northern Italy and Flanders turned out to be the forerunners of the nascent bourgeois urban class of the later years. G. Poggi, Ibid. The main source of rival authority to the feudal aristocracy was the church. Having forged rival networks between and among states, it claimed spiritual authority which provoked the monarch, the secular authority, to claim and fight for supremacy. In these circumstances were sown the seeds of modern conceptions of sovereignty. Before states gave way to the state, i.e., a unified and integrated political structure, they had to combat their internal dissensions as much as the spiritual claims of papacy to central authority. Amid all these rivalries, some important political innovations can be seen there in the field, practically working, e.g., the autonomous system of rule by leading citizens in compliance of a charter in major towns' cities. The foremost contribution of this period, 8, lay in the emergence and articulation of a secular authority, which till date remains a universally accepted desirable political good. The absolutist state, against this medieval background of wreckage of institutions and the political order, arose a new form of state rooted in these independent, nationally unified Renaissance monarchies in countries like France, Spain, and England. Challenges before this absolutist state included absorption of weaker and small territories, application of a more unitary, continuous, calculable, and effective rule with its power gathered under a single sovereign head. Poggi, op. Cit. Major issues confronting the absolutist state, which in fact was the forerunner of the bourgeois constitutional state in England, at first, included commutation of feudal dues into money rents, supplanting of feudal military obligations by raising standing professional armies, raising of taxes centrally and regularly by the state, etc., through mercantilism, the dominant economic doctrine under absolutism. State and crown assumed a directive role in commercial enterprises, while territorial boundaries assumed strategic significance. A formalized system of interstate relations, sustained through formal diplomacy and dynastic marriage alliances, came into vogue. The state bureaucracies were expanded, and the courts were raised as adjuncts of monarchs' rule. The absolutist ruler ruled from his court, not through it, and law became not a framework of rule, so much as an instrument for rule, assimilated to the sovereign power of throne, ibid. In the 16th century, Jean Bodin capped this development with the doctrine of divine right of kings. The principle of partnership and rule between monarchy and the people, which characterized the estate system during the later phase of feudalism, disappeared under absolutism. In England, Stuart kings' attempts to rule and raise taxes without Parliament participating in it led to the outbreak of the English Revolution of 1640s. Out there in the society, sections of gentry along with the emerging commercial classes, urban artisans and laboring classes rose in revolt against the claims of absolutism, power of the court, and the rigidity of mercantilism. Revolts against the ancient regimes in France precipitated the decline of absolutist state in England and elsewhere, where the bourgeois development processes centering around the emergence of private property occurred at an increasingly rapid pace. First, the emerging new classes achieved a predominant presence in the civil society, and later, they claimed a share in the state's power and rule. A new conception of state thus takes its origin from these stirring circumstances, where the power is to be shared, and the rights of the upper and middle ranks of society to participate in power, along with the ruler, was guaranteed by law and formalized in a constitutional system. These developments emphasizing contractual, liberal, and constitutional forms of rule marked the beginning of the bourgeois revolutions and the threshold of the modern state. C. S. Hall, 1990. Development of the modern state. It is neither useful nor possible to precisely date the origins of the modern state, though emergence of one can be indicated with the help of some of the specific features characterizing the contemporary state. These features include: I. Power is shared, as against earlier concentrated form. Roman II. Rights to participate in a government are legally and/or constitutionally defined. Roman III. Ever-widening, inclusive representation. Roman IV. Secular 9. Central authority, and v. Boundaries of national sovereignty are clearly defined. A state form of this type emerged very unevenly across Europe. It was there in Britain in 18th century, though nothing like it was to be found in Germany till the end of 19th century. Having risen in response to the struggling bourgeois classes, this state is characterized as classical liberal state with twin clear tasks of a. Fighting down the rigidities of mercantilism and of the ancient regime, and b. Guaranteeing the rights and liberties of the individual. By definition, these tasks made individuals the priori of the state and not vice versa. Classical liberalism made the state subject to law, No interference with the individual liberties is permitted unless legally sanctioned. These are the circumstances in which the doctrine of laissez-faire, let alone originated, prohibiting the state out of economic transaction of the people. However, the liberal capitalist state was not democratic. Majority of the ordinary people were kept out of this state process, though soon after, these masses launched reform movements in the 19th century, claiming more concessions for the lower and the laboring classes of people. The classical liberal state overcame this popular challenge without undergoing any fundamental change, though it allowed to deepen its popular base and its democratic contents, as the people won series of political and civil rights. In the end, democracy was grafted onto the liberal state, and a liberal democratic state was thus born with contradictions congenitally built into its structure. Faced with democratic challenges from inside, modern states started becoming interventionist states so as to be able to act and plan organically on behalf of the society as a whole. This move towards collectivism took several directions, as the imperial powers fought themselves out in their scramble for markets. Ordinarily, dominant classes supported an interventionist state for greater national efficiency, whereas the poor masses depended on the state to reign in the industrial capitalism, so that their living conditions would improve along with assured economic equality and social justice. The interwar years witnessed this tumult of collectivism taking at least three directions: emergence of communist states, of fascist states, and later, of the welfare state, after 1945. The evolutionary reformist collectivism culminated in welfare state, whereas the revolutionary collectivism culminated in the formation of communist states following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Russia. These two strands of state formation spread themselves over the globe, so much so that at one point of time, 1/3 of global population were under communist rule. Welfare states' association with democracy went pari passu, though the range of welfare giving varied widely from one state to another. Broadly, however, it can be said that if the political reforms of the 19th century were the first step of reformism in modifying the classical liberal state, welfare was the second installment, entailing widening of citizenship to include some social and economic rights, Roman II, the end of strict laissez-faire, and Roman III, massive expansion of state bureaucracy. If the state was kept out of the individual affairs during the classical liberalism phase, the reverse swing went to an extreme with the emergence of fascist states in Italy, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. The liberal mind remained perplexed all these years at the dictatorships, as the individual's space of freedom shrunk and the politics of the state became substantially directive. 10. This reverse swing favoring state took yet another extreme plunge, though with less directiveness. This state process was epitomized by corporatist bargaining between state, capital, and the organized labor, which was broadly manifest in the Labor/Social Democratic Party rule in Europe during 1960s and 1970s. The conservatives seldom radically differed from this line. As Stuart Hall Op. Cit. observes, the expansion of the state into the whole fabric of the civil society and private life belongs par excellence to this period. Advocates of rational capitalism wanted a big state which can only carry advanced capitalism effectively, whereas the Social Democrats believed that a powerful state can always help ameliorate the adverse effects of capitalism, without, however, destroying the system. The state actually had fewer challenges to cope with, but the issues beleaguering this state suddenly became overwhelming as the political slogans of "roll back the state" sent the air, paving the way for the advent of neoliberal state. Neoliberal state is the state of the globalization period we are passing through, and the moot question about this state is, has it really withered away? 3. 4 Interrogating Neo-liberal State in the Era of Globalization, from the mid-1980s onwards. The new right on the global scene in general, and the political regimes of USA and UK in particular, have devised for themselves a program of action centrally aiming to roll back the state. These programs consisted of proposals to curb state intervention, cut state bureaucracy and public expenditure, reduce welfare, privatize state-run enterprises, arrest the trend towards collectivism, restrict the power of the trade unions, restore competitive individualism, and the doctrines of free market liberalism. Essentially, it represented a move to restore the ideal of classical liberal state, but under the conditions laid down by the advanced capitalism, which is passing off as globalization. Hence the word neoliberal state. Neoliberalism is actually a capitalist accumulation strategy, a specific growth model which, at the same time, comes complete with its extra-economic preconditions. It is a return to the liberalism of free market in a strategic sense. The class collaboration which capital sought in the wake of its downfall during the Great Depression and subsequently realized in the form of a welfare state is no longer acceptable. The other unique feature of this ideology of the new right is to undermine nation-state-based capital mobilization with the resulting damage to the politics of the affected states. Permeable borders have been encouraged by the transnational capital, and international finance has set about reorganizing the world economy. Mobile capital is now in a position to twist the arms of the taxing states to minimize its tax burdens, though it would mean a fiscal crisis for individual states. The other aspects of neoliberalism include diverse facilitation made possible and available by WTO and IMF to the transnationals. Concretely, it means the demands made by these powerful global governance institutions to privatize electricity, water, and many other basic services. Part of neoliberalism is the marginalizing of the democratic process. Governments can no longer choose their economy freely without consulting or upping their antennas towards IMF and WTO. Yet, another feature lies in what is called venue shifting, in which the relatively more democratic international institutions are 11. Deprived of resources and decision-making powers in favor of those where the rich countries are decidedly more powerful. Thus, there is a shift of decision-making authority away from the UN General Assembly towards the IMF. The World Bank and WTO have likewise expanded their powers in comparison to the earlier GATT. Responsibility for education, environment, and healthcare are being shifted from the UNESCO and WHO to the World Bank, which also has arrogated to itself the role of a political advisor to the lonely countries. All these global governance institutions come into the process of acting in this neoliberal era only as per the terms set by the capital under which government policymakers can act. As W.K. Tabb, 2003, has elaborated, the way this works is that policies are first discussed by corporate leaders in groups such as Business Roundtable in the United States and its counterparts in Europe and Japan. Then there are meetings of the working groups of such organizations as the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, making detailed proposals that they pass on to their national negotiators and monitoring them to be sure they get what they ask for. These are the dynamics of globalization, whose forces seek to strengthen the rich countries usually at the expense of the poor countries and the poor people in both the worlds. What has happened to nation-state? Is it in a position to confront the gale of globalization? Does it mean the end of nation-state? We already know the answer from the early propounder of this thesis, Francis Fukuyama. Let us examine this thesis to identify and articulate the new agendas for the states to fulfill in this era of globalization. The end of nation-state thesis, ENT, is usually advanced for 3 reasons. Globalization of trade and capital has undermined the economic autonomy of the state. The world of states is being replaced by a world of societies. The relics of the world of states have been eliminated in Europe with the end of the East-West conflict, observed Ernst Otto Czempiel. In international politics, we deal now less with states as compared to international organizations, NGOs, and other non-state actors. The territorial basis of political modernity is being undermined today by new forms of economic modernity. In place of the self-contained nation-state is a network, modeled after transnational firms, detached from territorial forms of order, and representing an open system without borders, Ditgen, 1998. In most of the reflections on globalization and its impact on nation-state, there is a need to separate rhetoric from the reality and a new look to be given to the evolving agenda of the state. For example, how does one view the perennial problem of cross-border terrorism across Indo-Pak border if it is a borderless world we are living in? As George Simmel has pointed out, The border is not a spatial fact with a sociological impact, but a sociological fact that shapes spatially. Viewed from this sociological perspective, we can see the challenges of the state are now demanding a fresh look different from the conventional pre-globalization days. For example, today's social reality along the borders may be less determined by the advanced nature of technology. A rich neighbor may be having as compared to the fear of mass migrations from a week 12. Neighboring state. The northern countries are increasingly closing their borders against refugees to curb illegal immigration. This problem is a running sore along the borders of USA and Mexico, Germany and Poland, among and several African countries. Easy availability of deadly weapons can create a 9/11 catastrophe, which has disfigured the international power equation altogether. The recent serial bomb blasts by terrorists in London would also have long-term repercussions on the same lines. Similarly, despite the universal nature of human rights and the visible importance it has acquired of late, the fact still stands that the international protection of human rights has yet to cross the threshold of sovereignty. The individual has no direct function as a legal entity at the level of international law. The state of which he is a citizen acts as mediary. It is true that international organizations are recognized by International Labor Organization, ILO, but the nation-state still remains the most important institution for enforcing these laws and for giving legal protection. There is practically no democratic method of control and no general democratic public beyond the territorial state, IBID. The economic argument for the ENT sounds the strongest, though loss of functions suffered by the borders of a nation-state gets compensated by a new set of tasks, which have filled its agenda. In any case, a definitive form of global control is not possible in this multitude of intricate networks which characterizes the global order today. The state, as the governmental agency, is often called upon to perform the role of a coordinator between a multitude of actors participating in the negotiations. Internationally, the nation-state is becoming a competition state within the framework of a world market. It has taken on itself the function of coordinating within the transnational negotiation system. Cerny, 1997. This is, however, not to minimize the importance of the stark reality of the state losing its welfare functions, and probably, through that route, a considerable measure of its legitimacy. State intervention now is shifting increasingly from the macroeconomic to the microeconomic level, and its presence is felt more at the grassroots level, either through mediation of its lower bureaucracy or the collaborating NGOs. Another set of powerful observations focus on the institution of citizenship, which, it has been argued, is losing its meaning. Authors such as Yasemin Soysal and Saskia Sasson have advanced the view that a variety of forms of membership not defined by national borders are taking the place of citizenship. But as these authors have taken care to mention, actual realization of citizenship benefits is bound to the boundaries of the nation-states. This also includes enjoyment of social rights independently of citizenship. Whether it is in Europe or in the USA, social rights are reserved for citizens and restricted for legal immigrants. The statelessness experiment of the European Union of 25 states is blatant in its breach than whatever little achievement has been registered in the direction of unification. Virtually, there is no international law which can force entry into a country. And on the issue of migration, nation-states defend their sovereignty with utmost determination. 3.5 conclusion thus, a reading of the tortuous evolutionary path the state has been through historically should convince you that a new type of state is emerging. A state, which is growing in the presence of competition, markets, non-state actors, and a number of international control agencies. It has become a part of the system which thrives on transnational 13. Negotiations, borderless trade, information technology, and network governance. We will read more about it in the subsequent units of this course. So, how do we conclude? Whichever way we may conclude, the fact remains that the nation-state does not emerge unscathed from the torrents of globalization. And Roman 2, if we choose to train our sights responsively, it is not difficult to observe the same state saddled with a host of responsibilities, including some new ones. What the state has lost is what Ferdinand Tönnies called Gemeinschaft, i.e., a holistic character, a sense of organic solidarity, which is beyond pragmatism and a set of given tasks. As Philip G. Cerny, Op. Cit. has observed, if there is an increasingly paradigmatic crisis of the state today, it concerns the erosion of this posited underlying bond and the demotion of the state to a mere pragmatic association for common ends, what Tönnies called Gesellschaft and Michael Oakeshott called enterprise association. The end of nation-state thesis, therefore, is based on a narrow viewing of the role of state. This is the outcome of a mechanical interpretation of state. As Bob Jessup, continuing further the unfinished researches of Nikos Poulantzas on the relative autonomy of state thesis, has observed, the state is not simply something towards which one must adopt a political strategy, but is something, or better, a social relation, which can be fruitfully analyzed as the site, the generator and the product of strategies. Further, it is not a unitary force, but rather a specific institutional ensemble with multiple boundaries, no institutional fixity, and no pre-given formal or substantive unity. Any substantive unity which a state system might possess derives from specific political projects and struggles to impose unity or coherence on that system. C.F. Pearson, Op. Cit. Taking Bob Jessup's parameters, one can argue that a new nation-state with new boundaries and a new set of agendas is in the making, which is what should not be confused for end of state. Empirically speaking, what we are experiencing in these days of globalization is an accelerated intensification of transnational relations, Jessup's political project. A loss of autonomy has been caused to this state with the dire implications for the society. State's loss of autonomy, however, does not suggest, either logically or empirically, loss of sovereignty. This new avatar of the nation-state, i.e. the neoliberal state, is saddled with an ever-increasing load of responsibilities to coordinate among diverse domestic and foreign policy networks. We will read more on neoliberal perspective in Unit 5 of this course. On the sovereignty front, however, no viable alternative has appeared on the global horizons, and this would delay the advent of a cosmopolitan democracy or one world, since cosmopolitan law is a necessary consequence of a routine, normally functioning constitutional state. Till then, we have to make do with this new state, which is always open for progressive changes in response to forces of globalization from below. 3. 6 Key CONCEPTS Bolshevik Revolution, coup organized by Vladimir Lenin and carried out by the Bolshevik radical group of the Russian Social Democratic Labor to overthrow the Provisional Government of Russia in November 1917. It is also known as October Revolution. The revolution was led by 14. Leon Trotsky and marked the first official communist revolution of the 20th century, based upon the ideas of Karl Marx. Fordist the social institutions of mass production, collectively called Fordism. GATT General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that was originally negotiated in Geneva, Switzerland in 1947 to increase international trade by reducing tariffs and other trade barriers. GATT provides a code of conduct for international commerce and provides a framework for periodic multilateral trade negotiations on trade liberalization and expansion. A round of negotiations pertaining to free international trade and limiting quotas and tariffs was held in Punta del Este, Uruguay in 1987 www. Esifum, RDG, AC, UK/glossary. HTM Global Civil Society. It is an emerging reality, still under construction, not completely defined in its composition and functions. It is a social expression of the awakening of an authentic planetary culture, grounded in the spiritual values and social experience of hundreds of millions of people. Global civil society emerged as a major social force to resist an assault on life and democracy by the institutions of corporate globalization. Initially, the resistance centered on World Bank, IMF, and WTO. Subsequently, it shifted to global corporations and financial markets. The global civil society has presented its public face in massive demonstrations in countries around the globe. The organized expression of these sources of socio-political energy has been also identified as globalization from below, www. Co. Int and Center for Alternative Development Initiatives, draft paper. Great Depression, it was a global economic slump that hit North America and other industrialized areas of the world between 1929-34. It was precipitated by the collapse of the U.S. stock market in October 1929. The term depression denotes, in economic sense, a cyclical phase of the economy with high unemployment of labor and capital, business consumer pessimism, falling prices, etc. www. LCWeb2 lock. gov/frd/cs/chile/cl-glows. HTM International Monetary Fund, IMF, established along with the World Bank in 1946. The IMF is a specialized agency affiliated with the United Nations and is responsible for stabilizing international exchange rates and payments. IMF tries to provide loans to its members, including industrialized and developing countries, when they experience balance of payments difficulties. These loans often carry conditions that require substantial internal economic adjustments by the recipients, most of which are developing countries. www.wsit. org/traders/glossary. HTM. 15. Keynes, Welfare Capitalism. It is an economic theory based on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. In Keynes's theory general, macro-level, trends can overwhelm the micro-level behavior of individuals. Keynes asserted the importance of the aggregate demand for goods as the drawing factor, especially in downturns. He argued that government policies could be used to promote demand at macro level to fight high unemployment and deflation of the sort seen in the 1930s. Keynes' thoughts conflict with the tenets of classical economics, supply side of economics, and Austrian School of Economics. www.n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Keynesian economics. Luddites. As per the Wikipedia, the Luddites or Ludds were a social movement of English workers in the early 1800s who protested often by destroying textile machines against the changes produced by the Industrial Revolution that they felt threatened for their jobs. The movement began in 1811 and was named after a probably mythical leader, End Ludd. Since then, the term Luddite has been used to describe anyone opposed to technological progress and technological change. McDonaldization. It is the process by which a society takes on the characteristics of a fast food restaurant. The term was coined by sociologist George Ritzer. It is a reconceptualization of rationalization, or moving from traditional to rational modes of thought and scientific management. 4 primary components of McDonaldization are efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. http://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/McDonaldization. Mercantilism, an economic philosophy of the 16th and 17th centuries that laid that international commerce should primarily serve to increase a country's financial wealth, especially of gold and foreign currency. It stresses on the development and control of tradable goods as a means to foster the general good or wealth of a country. www. Personal. Umich. edu/glossary/m. HTML. Pari passu with equal speed or simultaneously and equally. UNESCO. United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, is a specialized agency of the United Nations system established in 1946. The main objective of the organization is to contribute to peace and security by promoting collaboration among the nations through education, science, and culture in order to further universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Washington Consensus, Prof. John Williamson's expression, which conveys the ideological consensus shared by Washington-headquartered government and international organizations, consisting of the 16 Government of USA, World Bank, IMF, etc., as distinguished from the organizations like UNESCO, who, etc., headquartered elsewhere, also discussed in the key concepts of Unit 1. World Trade Organization, WTO. It is a global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At its heart are the WTO agreements, negotiated and signed by the world's trading nations. The goal is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers conduct their business. The headquarters of WTO are located at Geneva, Switzerland. www.wto.org/English/doxy/doxy. HTM3